I always thought that phrase, once a cheater, always a cheater, was just something people said to make themselves feel better after being betrayed. A way to convince themselves they were better off without someone who had hurt them so deeply. But when those words came from James's lips 5 years ago, they seemed like a solemn vow, a personal code he lived by. The disgust in his eyes when he talked about his friend who had cheated on his girlfriend was so genuine, so visceral, that it made me fall in love with him a little more each time. I could never respect someone who would do that, he told me on our third date, his fingers intertwined with mine across the table. Once a cheater, always a cheater. People don't change their core values. How ironic those words seem now as I sit in my car outside the Holiday Inn Express, staring at room 237's drawn curtains, knowing exactly what's happening behind them. My husband of 4 years is in there with someone who isn't me. The same man who once looked at me with such conviction, swearing he could never understand how someone could betray the person they love. Yet here we are. My phone buzzes in my lap. It's a text from Amy, my best friend since college. Did you see them? Are you okay? I can't answer that. I'm not sure I'll ever be okay again. But I'm certain of one thing. James doesn't know it yet, but he's about to learn exactly what happens when you betray someone who once believed every word you said. They say revenge is a dish best served cold. Mine has been 5 years in the making, and I didn't even know it. I met James Walker at my cousin's wedding 5.5 years ago. He was the best man. I was a bridesmaid, and the chemistry between us was immediate and electric. I'd never experienced anything like it, that instant connection that makes your skin tingle and your heart race. He asked for my number during the reception, and by the time the newlyweds left for their honeymoon, we'd already planned our first date. James was everything I thought I wanted: successful, charming, attentive, and seemingly devoted to the idea of honesty and loyalty. He was 2 years older than me, already established in his career as a financial analyst, while I was still finding my footing as an interior designer. He had this confidence about him that I found irresistible, a certainty about who he was and what he wanted from life. "I've dated enough to know what I want," he told me during those early weeks. No games, no lies, just two people who respect each other enough to be honest. I believed him completely. Why wouldn't I? He spoke about fidelity and trust with such conviction. Our relationship moved quickly. Within 6 months, we were living together in his downtown apartment. By our 1-year anniversary, he proposed during a weekend trip to the coast, down on one knee as the sun set over the water. It was like a dream, the kind of romance you see in movies but never quite believe happens in real life. The wedding was everything I'd imagined, a perfect spring day surrounded by friends and family who all commented on how perfect we seemed together, how they'd never seen either of us so happy. And we were happy. At least I was happy. I thought he was too. We settled into married life easily. We had our routines, our inside jokes, our plans for the future. We talked about starting a family in a year or two, once we'd saved enough to buy a house in the suburbs. James worked long hours sometimes, but I understood. His career was demanding, and he was ambitious. I was proud of his dedication, even if it meant he occasionally missed dinner or came home after I was already asleep. The first 3 years of our marriage were good. Not perfect, no relationship is, but good. We had arguments like any couple, usually about small things. Him not picking up after himself, me spending too much on home decor, whose turn it was to visit which in-laws for the holidays. Normal stuff, nothing that ever made me doubt us. Then, about a year ago, things began to change in ways so subtle I almost didn't notice. It started with his phone. James had always been somewhat protective of it. He worked with confidential financial information after all, but suddenly it seemed like he was never more than an arm's length from it. He'd take it with him to the shower, leaving it on the bathroom counter. He started turning it face down whenever he set it on a table. If I came into a room while he was texting, he'd quickly pocket the device. "Work stuff," he'd say with a dismissive smile if I asked who he was messaging so intently at 11 p.m. on a Saturday. Then came the late nights at the office that grew more and more frequent, the work dinners that left his breath smelling faintly of wine when he finally crawled into bed beside me, the business trips that seemed to multiply on his calendar. I'm ashamed to admit how long I ignored these signs. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was letting my insecurities get the better of me. James had been so adamant about his views on cheating, had expressed such disgust for people who betrayed their partners, that I couldn't bring myself to believe he would do that to me. Besides, wasn't I the lucky one? Hadn't all my friends expressed their envy at how I'd found such a devoted husband? How could I question that when I had no real evidence, just a growing unease I couldn't quite shake? I might have gone on believing in us indefinitely if it weren't for what happened 3 months ago. It was a Thursday night, and James had texted that he would be working late. Again. I decided to surprise him with dinner from his favorite Thai restaurant. I knew his office building's security guard, Manuel, who had met me enough times to wave me through with a smile. I took the elevator to the 14th floor, balancing the takeout bags as I made my way to his corner office. The financial firm where James worked was mostly empty at 8 p.m. A few offices still had lights on, but the open floor of cubicles was dark and quiet. I could see light spilling from under James's door, though, confirming he was still there. I was about to knock when I heard his laugh, that special, warm laugh that had always made me feel like I was the most entertaining person in the world. But he wasn't laughing at something I'd said. He was on the phone. "I know, I miss you too," I heard him say, his voice soft in a way that made my stomach clench. "No, she has no idea. Yeah, I'll be there. Can't wait." I stood frozen outside that door, the smell of pad thai suddenly nauseating. Every instinct told me to burst in, to confront him, to demand explanations. But something held me back, a combination of shock and humiliatingly fear. Fear of what I would see in his eyes if I confronted him. Fear that everything I thought we had was a lie. So instead, I did something I'm not proud of. I set the food down silently by his door and left as quietly as I'd come. Manuel gave me a concerned look as I hurried through the lobby, but I avoided his eyes. That night, I lay awake beside James, studying the profile of his sleeping face in the dim light filtering through our bedroom curtains. Who was he, really? This man I'd pledged my life to, whose children I had planned to bear, whose last name I now carried. Was he a stranger? The next morning, I made a decision. Before confronting him, I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with. If he was cheating, I needed proof, not just for him, but for myself. Because some part of me still wanted to believe I was wrong, that there was an explanation that wouldn't shatter our life together. I started paying attention in a way I hadn't before. I noted the evenings he came home late and the excuses he gave. I watched how he angled his body away from me when he checked his messages. I made mental notes of the business trips that seemed to fall on convenient weekends. 2 weeks of this heightened awareness left me with suspicions, but still no concrete proof. Then came the moment that changed everything. James had gone to take a shower, and his phone, left carelessly on the kitchen counter, lit up with a text notification. I shouldn't have looked. I'd never been the type to snoop, but the preview message visible on the screen turned my blood to ice. "Can't stop thinking about last night? Same room next week?" The sender was listed as Greg W. Work, but I knew immediately this was no colleague. James didn't even have a Greg in his department. I'd met his team at the company Christmas party just months earlier. With shaking hands, I picked up his phone. It was locked, of course, but I knew his passcode. He'd given it to me years ago and never changed it. 2508, the date we met. Another bitter irony to add to the growing pile. I opened the message thread and felt my world collapse around me. The texts between James and Greg went back months. They were explicit, affectionate, and devastating. There were arrangements for meetups at hotels, references to weekends spent together during supposed business trips, complaints about having to keep up appearances with me. The woman's real name was Melissa. From their texts, I gathered she worked at a competing financial firm. They had met at a conference last year, around the time I'd first noticed the changes in James's behavior. I heard the shower turn off and quickly replaced the phone exactly as I'd found it. When James came into the kitchen, hair still damp, I somehow managed to smile and ask if he wanted coffee. That night, and for many nights after, I lay beside him battling between confrontation and calculation. The old me wanted to scream, to cry, to demand answers and apologies. But something colder, something harder had taken root inside me, a voice that whispered, "Don't show your hand. Not yet." Because the truth was, as devastated as I felt, I also felt a strange, almost frightening clarity. This man, who had once looked me in the eyes and said, "Once a cheater, always a cheater," with such conviction, had been living a double life at my expense. The hypocrisy was breathtaking, the betrayal complete, and so I made another decision. If James could lead a double life, so could I. On the outside, I would remain the loving, unsuspecting wife, but inside I would be planning, watching, waiting for the right moment to make sure he understood exactly what he had thrown away and what it would cost him. Earth to Olivia. Hello? Amy's voice snapped me back to the present, her hand waving in front of my face. We were sitting in a corner booth at Cafe Meridian, our regular Saturday morning spot. I'd been staring blankly at my untouched latte for who knows how long, lost in memories of how I'd gotten to this point. Sorry, I murmured, wrapping my cold fingers around the mug. Just thinking. Amy's face softened with concern. She was the only person who knew what was going on, the only person I trusted enough to tell. You look exhausted, she said. Are you sleeping at all? I gave a short, humorless laugh. Not really. It's hard to sleep next to someone when you're plotting their downfall. Liv, Amy began, her tone cautious. I know you're hurt and you have every right to be, but are you sure this is the way to handle it? Wouldn't it be simpler to just confront him, file for divorce, and move on with your life? I took a sip of my now lukewarm coffee and considered her question. It was one I'd asked myself countless times over the past months. Wouldn't it be healthier to just end things cleanly? To tell James I knew about Melissa, divide our assets, and start rebuilding my life? It would be simpler, I agreed. But he doesn't deserve simple. Amy studied me, concern evident in her eyes. We'd been friends since our freshman year of college, had seen each other through breakups and family dramas and career crises. But this was different. I could tell she was worried about what this situation was doing to me, how it was changing me. I just don't want you to lose yourself in this, she said carefully. Revenge might feel good in the moment, but then what? You still have to live with yourself afterward. I'm not losing myself, I countered, though even I wasn't entirely convinced that was true. I'm just making sure he faces consequences for his actions. Real consequences, not just getting to walk away with a whoops, sorry I broke your heart and starting fresh with her. Amy sighed, recognizing the determination in my voice. So what's the plan? You've been tracking their meetups for weeks now. What's the end game here? That was the question, wasn't it? In the 2 months since discovering James's affair, I'd been meticulously collecting evidence. I had photographs of them entering and leaving hotels together. I had copies of their text messages. I even had receipts for gifts he'd bought her, charged to our joint credit card no less. I had enough to destroy him in a divorce, but that wasn't enough. Not for a man who had spent years loudly proclaiming once a cheater, always a cheater, while secretly being exactly what he claimed to despise. I'm still working out the details, I told Amy. But it needs to be public. It needs to be something he can't just explain away or recover from quickly. He needs to feel exposed the way I felt when I read those messages. Amy didn't look convinced. Just be careful, okay? Don't do anything illegal. And remember that hurting him won't necessarily heal you. I know, I said, though the truth was I wasn't sure if anything could heal the particular kind of wound that comes from having your reality completely upended. From discovering that the person you trusted most had been lying to your face for months, maybe years. We finished our coffee, talking about other things. Amy's job, her new apartment, the latest terrible date she'd been on. Normal things that belonged to a world I no longer felt part of. Before we parted ways outside the cafe, she hugged me tightly. I'm here for you, she whispered. Whatever you decide to do, I'm on your side, but please don't let this consume you. I hugged her back, grateful for her loyalty, but knowing she couldn't possibly understand. How could she? She hadn't lain awake night after night beside a traitor, listening to him breathe, wondering if he was dreaming of someone else. As I walked back to my car, my phone buzzed with a text from James. Working late tonight, don't wait up. I almost laughed out loud at the predictability of it. It was Friday, after all, one of his regular nights with Melissa, if the pattern held. For a moment, I considered responding with something that would let him know I was on to him, something that would wipe the smug confidence from his face. But no, not yet. Tonight, I would follow them again, add to my growing collection of evidence, and I would continue refining my plan. Because James Walker was about to learn that some lessons are taught in the harshest possible ways. And once a cheater, always a cheater, was just the beginning. The Holiday Inn Express on the north side of the city wasn't exactly the luxury hotel I would have expected James to choose for his affair. But then again, it made sense from a practical standpoint. It was far enough from our social circle that he was unlikely to be recognized, but close enough to both his office and Melissa's apartment to be convenient. I sat in my car in the back corner of the parking lot, a position that gave me a clear view of the entrance while keeping me mostly hidden. I'd done this enough times now that I had a routine: park, turn off the engine, adjust my seat to a comfortable position, and settle in for however long it took. Today, I didn't have to wait long. James's silver BMW pulled into the lot just after 7 p.m., and he emerged looking relaxed and confident in the casual clothes he'd changed into before leaving the office: jeans and a blue button-down I'd given him for his birthday last year. He checked his phone, glanced around, though not carefully enough to spot me, and walked inside. 20 minutes later, a red Audi parked several spaces away from his car. Melissa stepped out, and I felt the now familiar twist in my stomach at the sight of her. She was beautiful in an effortless way, tall and slender with long dark hair that fell in waves down her back. Today she wore a floral dress that fluttered around her knees in the evening breeze. I watched as she checked her reflection in her car window, applied a fresh coat of lipstick, and headed for the hotel entrance with the confident stride of someone who had done this many times before. And just like that, they were both inside, in room 237 if their previous pattern held, doing things I tried not to visualize too vividly for the sake of my own sanity. I waited, as I always did, to make sure they were settled in for the evening. Sometimes these meetings were brief, a quick after-work rendezvous before James came home to me with excuses about client dinners or late meetings. But Friday nights were different. Friday nights, he usually stayed until morning, texting me about impromptu work emergencies or claiming he was too tired to drive home safely. Once I was certain they were ensconced in their bubble of betrayal, I started the car and drove to the office building where James worked. His firm occupied 3 floors of a sleek downtown high-rise, all glass and polished steel. The parking garage underneath was accessible with a key card, which I still had on my keyring from the days when I would surprise him with lunch. I pulled into a visitor spot, grabbed my purse, and headed for the elevators. It was just past 8 p.m. now, late enough that the building would be mostly empty, but not so late that my presence would seem suspicious. The security guard at the front desk was new, someone I didn't recognize, which worked in my favor. I smiled confidently as I approached, already pulling out my story. "Hi there," I said, voice friendly but businesslike. "I'm James Walker's wife. He called and asked me to pick up some files he forgot in his office. Said it was urgent for a presentation tomorrow morning." I held up my key card as evidence of my connection to the building. The guard, young, probably working his way through college, barely glanced at me. "Sign in here, please," he said, pushing a visitor log toward me. I signed my name and headed for the elevators, heart pounding despite how easy that had been. As the elevator climbed to the 14th floor, I mentally rehearsed my route. James's office was on the northeast corner, with views of the city skyline that he'd often bragged about. I'd been there enough times to know my way around, to know where he kept important documents, to know which desk drawer held his spare key fob for his computer. The elevator doors opened to a dimly lit floor. As expected, most offices were dark, though a few workaholics were still at their desks in distant corners. I walked purposefully toward James's office, footsteps muffled by the plush carpet. No one looked up or questioned me, just another person working late on a Friday. James's office door was locked, but I had anticipated this. From my purse, I retrieved the spare key he kept in his bedside drawer at home, a key he probably didn't even remember giving me years ago when he'd first gotten this office. "Just in case," he'd said then so trustingly. The lock clicked open softly and I slipped inside, closing the door behind me. I didn't turn on the main lights, instead using the small desk lamp that cast just enough glow for me to see what I was doing, without attracting attention from outside. James's office was meticulously organized, one trait of his I'd always admired. His desk was clear except for his computer, a framed photo of us from our honeymoon, the hypocrisy of which never failed to infuriate me, and a leather-bound planner he used despite having every meeting also logged in his digital calendar. I sat in his ergonomic chair and reached for the bottom right drawer where he kept his spare computer fob. Finding it exactly where I expected, I plugged it into the USB port and waited for the computer to recognize it. The screen lit up, asking for a password. This was the trickiest part. I had 3 guesses before the system would lock and alert IT security. But I knew James, knew his patterns, his sentimentality despite his attempts to appear strictly logical. I typed in Brooklyn 2508, our dog's name plus the date we met. Nothing. I took a deep breath and tried again. Mel James 2023. A hunch based on a pattern I'd noticed in passwords he used for less secure accounts. The screen remained locked. One more try. I thought carefully, trying to put myself in his mindset. What would be significant enough to remember easily, but not obvious to others? Then it came to me, the room number from the first hotel where he and Melissa had met, according to texts I'd read. I typed Westin 1121 and held my breath. The lock screen disappeared, replaced by his desktop. I had to resist the urge to pump my fist in victory. Working quickly now, I inserted the USB drive I'd brought and began copying specific files, financial records, client information, emails that showed questionable ethical choices James had made in his dealings. Nothing illegal necessarily, but definitely things his firm and clients wouldn't be happy to have exposed. While the files transferred, I looked through his desk drawers, finding exactly what I'd hoped for, a small velvet box containing an emerald necklace with a gift receipt from last week. Nearly $2,000 spent on a gift that certainly wasn't for me, charged to our joint account. I pocketed the receipt and continued my search, finding hotel confirmations, handwritten notes about meeting Melissa, even a list of excuses he'd apparently prepared to use with me. Reading working late, quarterly reports due, and drinks with Thompson client might crash at hotel in his familiar handwriting made me feel physically ill. The computer chimed softly, indicating the file transfer was complete. I carefully returned everything to its proper place, leaving no sign that I'd been there. Before logging out, I took a moment to check his email, finding several recent exchanges with Melissa that further confirmed the extent and duration of their affair. 20 minutes after entering his office, I was back in the elevator, USB drive securely in my purse along with photographs I'd taken of the physical evidence. My heart was racing, but not from fear. From a cold, clarifying anger that felt almost like power. As I drove away from his office building, I allowed myself a small, grim smile. Phase 1 of my plan was complete. I had everything I needed to destroy James professionally if I chose to. Combined with the evidence of his infidelity, I could ruin his carefully constructed life as thoroughly as he had ruined mine. But that wasn't enough. Not yet. Because James didn't just need to lose things. His job, his reputation, his relationship with Melissa. He needed to understand the depth of his betrayal. He needed to feel what I had felt when I discovered his lies. He needed to experience the particular kind of pain that comes from having your trust completely shattered by the person you believed in most. And for that, I needed more than evidence. I needed a perfect plan. The house was dark when I got home, exactly as I had left it hours earlier. I moved through the rooms, turning on lights, creating the illusion that I'd been here all evening, waiting for a husband who wouldn't return until morning. In the kitchen, I poured myself a generous glass of the expensive Cabernet James had brought home last weekend, probably feeling guilty after spending the previous night with Melissa. I took my wine and the USB drive to the small home office we shared, settling at my desk to review what I'd gathered. The files painted a damning picture. James had been cutting corners ethically for years. Nothing overtly illegal, but certainly skirting the edges of propriety. He'd shared confidential information about certain clients with others to facilitate deals that benefited him personally. He'd backdated documents to cover mistakes. He'd taken credit for analysis done by junior team members without acknowledging their work. None of it was necessarily enough to get him fired on its own, but collectively, delivered to the right people in the right way, it could certainly damage his pristine professional reputation and possibly end his career at the firm where he'd worked so hard to advance. I took notes methodically, organizing the information into categories: professional misconduct, financial impropriety, personal betrayal. As I worked, I could feel my emotional detachment growing, a self-protective mechanism perhaps, allowing me to view my husband's betrayal as a problem to be solved rather than a wound that was still bleeding. My phone buzzed with a text from James. "Meeting running late. Might just crash in the office. Don't wait up." I stared at the message, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. He wasn't even trying anymore. The excuses were getting lazier, more transparent. Did he think I was completely oblivious? Or did he simply not care enough to craft a believable lie? I considered my response carefully. Whatever I wrote needed to maintain the fiction that I suspected nothing. After all, the effectiveness of my plan depended on his continued belief in my ignorance. "Okay, don't work too hard. Love you," I wrote back, the words so false they almost burned my fingers as I typed them. Setting my phone aside, I returned to my notes, but found my concentration fracturing. Suddenly, the emotions I'd been holding at bay crashed over me in a wave so intense I could barely breathe. This man, This liar, this hypocrite, had stood before our friends and family and vowed to love and honor me all the days of his life. He had built a life with me based on a foundation of shared values that apparently only I had actually believed in. He had judged others harshly for the very behavior he was now engaging in, all while looking me in the eye day after day, sleeping beside me night after night, making plans for our future together. And for what? The excitement of an affair? The ego boost of having two women who wanted him? Was Melissa so extraordinary, so irresistible that she was worth destroying everything we had built? I found myself standing, though I had no memory of getting up from my chair. My wine glass lay shattered on the hardwood floor, red liquid spreading like blood across the pale surface. My hands were shaking violently, and tears I hadn't realized I was crying streamed down my face. For the first time since discovering James's betrayal, I allowed myself to feel the full force of my grief. I sank to the floor beside the spilled wine and broken glass, wrapped my arms around my knees and sobbed, deep, guttural cries that tore from my throat and left me gasping for air. I cried for the life I thought I had, for the husband I believed in, for the future I had planned with such certainty, for the children we had talked about having, who now would never exist, for the woman I had been before all of this, trusting, open-hearted, secure in her place in the world. I'm not sure how long I sat there, coming apart at the seams in the empty house that no longer felt like home. Eventually, the tears subsided, leaving behind a hollow exhaustion and sticky, salt-stained cheeks. I carefully picked up the larger pieces of broken glass, then cleaned the wine from the floor, working methodically, focusing on the simple physical task to ground myself. When the floor was clean again, I went to the bathroom and splashed cold water on my face, avoiding my own red-rimmed eyes in the mirror. This breakdown had been necessary, perhaps, a release valve for emotions that had been building too much pressure. But it couldn't happen again, not if I wanted to see my plan through. Back at my desk, I closed the files I'd been reviewing and opened a new document. At the top, I typed, "The Reckoning of James Walker." Melodramatic, perhaps, but satisfying in the moment. Below that, I began outlining what I wanted to accomplish. 1. James must lose what he values most, his reputation too. He must experience public humiliation comparable to what I would have felt had I discovered his affair conventionally. 3. He must be forced to face his hypocrisy directly. 4. Melissa must learn what kind of man she's really involved with. 5. All of this must happen in a way that doesn't make me look vindictive or unstable. I paused, considering that last point. It was important. I didn't want to emerge from this as the bitter, vengeful ex-wife. I wanted to walk away with my dignity intact, perhaps even with sympathy from those who would inevitably hear the story. Which meant I needed to be smart about this. Strategic. James couldn't know what hit him until it was too late to counter. And ideally, much of his downfall would appear to be of his own making. I thought about what I knew of James. His pride, his careful image management, his need to be respected by colleagues and envied by friends. I thought about the upcoming charity gala his firm sponsored annually, where he was slated to give a speech as newly promoted senior partner. I thought about Melissa, who based on their texts seemed to believe James planned to leave me for her soon. Slowly, a plan began to take shape in my mind. Not just a way to expose James's infidelity, but a carefully orchestrated series of events that would dismantle the life he had built, lie by lie, leaving him to face the consequences of his actions in the most public and undeniable way possible. It would take precision, timing, and absolute control over my own emotions, something I wasn't entirely confident in after tonight's breakdown. But the alternative, simply confronting him, going through a messy divorce, and walking away while he potentially continued his life with Melissa relatively unscathed, was unacceptable. I worked through the night, refining my plan, identifying potential weak points, mapping out a timeline. Dawn was breaking by the time I finally saved the document, encrypted the USB drive, and hid both in a place James would never look, the box of feminine hygiene products under the bathroom sink. Exhausted but somehow lighter, I crawled into our bed, the bed he had shared with me for years while keeping his secrets. In a few hours, he would return home with excuses about working all night, and I would pretend to believe him. I would smile and ask about his night, and he would lie to my face. But now, for the first time since discovering his betrayal, I felt a sense of purpose cutting through my grief and anger. James had broken our vows, had made a mockery of the trust I had placed in him, and soon, Not tomorrow, not next week, but soon, he would learn exactly what that decision had cost him. As sleep finally claimed me, my last coherent thought was a twist on his favorite saying, "Once betrayed, forever changed." The next 2 weeks passed in a strange state of suspended animation. On the surface, nothing had changed. James and I continued our routines, ate meals together when he was home, slept side by side in our king-sized bed. I asked about his day and told him about mine. We discussed upcoming plans and household matters. But beneath that thin veneer of normalcy, everything had changed. Each smile I gave him was calculated. Each question about his day was designed to catalog his lies. Each moment of physical affection, increasingly rare as his affair with Melissa intensified, was endured rather than enjoyed. And all the while, I was setting my plan in motion. Step 1 was establishing my own financial security. On Monday morning, I visited our bank and opened a separate account in my name only. I transferred half of our savings, money I was legally entitled to, but which would be much harder to access once everything exploded. I changed the mailing address for statements to a P.O. box I had rented the previous week. Step 2 was securing a place to live after the inevitable confrontation. I couldn't stay in our apartment, not with the memories it contained, and not when James's name was on the lease alongside mine. Through Amy, who had connections in real estate, I found a small but charming one-bedroom apartment in a secure building across town. I signed a 6-month lease and paid the deposit from my new account. Step 3 was more delicate, gathering allies without revealing too much too soon. I reached out to friends and family members I had somewhat neglected during my marriage, reconnecting over coffee or lunch. I didn't mention any problems with James, but I did emphasize how much I valued their presence in my life, laying groundwork for the support system I would need when everything fell apart. Through it all, James noticed nothing. Or if he did, he attributed any changes in my behavior to ordinary marital ebbs and flows. His own attention was too divided between work, his affair with Melissa, and maintaining his public image to observe the subtle shifts in his wife's demeanor. His carelessness both angered and helped me. Each oversight, each moment when he failed to ask why I seemed distant or why I had suddenly developed an interest in reconnecting with old friends, confirmed that his attention was elsewhere. Each time he accepted my excuses without question, that I was tired, that I had a work deadline, that I wasn't feeling well, it became clearer that he was too preoccupied with his own deceptions to notice mine. On Friday of the second week, as James prepared for another late meeting that I knew would take him to Melissa's apartment, I decided it was time to accelerate my timeline. "The Morgan Foundation Gala is next Saturday, right?" I asked casually as he knotted his tie in front of our bedroom mirror. James paused, his hands stilling for just a moment before continuing. "Yeah, that's right. Black tie at the Windsor Hotel downtown." "I found the perfect dress last weekend," I told him, watching his reflection for any reaction. "That deep blue one we saw at Neiman's." He met my eyes in the mirror and smiled, a smile that once would have warmed me, but now just felt like another performance. "You'll look beautiful in it. The entire executive team will be there, so it's an important night." "Because of your speech," I said, as if reminding myself. "As the newest senior partner." His smile widened, pride evident in his expression. "Exactly. The promotion becomes official that night." I maintained my supportive wife facade. "You've worked so hard for this. I'm proud of you." Something flickered in his eyes. Guilt, perhaps? But it was gone so quickly I might have imagined it. "Thanks, Liv. That means a lot." He finished with his tie and turned to kiss me goodbye, a quick peck that barely grazed my cheek. "Don't wait up tonight. This client meeting could run late, and then I need to finish those quarterly projections." "Of course," I said, squeezing his arm affectionately. "Good luck with the client." As soon as James left the apartment, I retrieved my laptop and the encrypted USB drive from their hiding place. The Morgan Foundation Gala was the perfect setting for what I had planned, a public event attended by everyone who mattered in James's professional and social circles, where he would be center stage at the precise moment his carefully constructed life began to unravel. I spent the evening finalizing details, making calls, sending carefully worded emails. By midnight, everything was arranged. The gala was 8 days away. In 8 days, James would stand at a podium prepared to accept accolades and deliver a speech about integrity and excellence, the very values he had betrayed in both his professional and personal life. In 8 days, everyone would know exactly who James Walker really was. I closed my laptop, feeling strangely calm. The anger and grief that had consumed me for weeks had transformed into something colder and more focused. This wasn't about hurting James the way he had hurt me, though that would certainly be a consequence. This was about justice, about truth, about making sure he couldn't simply walk away from the wreckage he had created and start fresh as if nothing had happened. My phone buzzed with a text from Amy. "You okay? Want company tomorrow?" I appreciated her concern, her steady presence throughout this ordeal. But I needed these final days of preparation to focus, to ensure nothing went wrong. "All good," I texted back. "Finalizing some work? Rain check for Sunday?" Her response came quickly. "You got it. Call if you need anything, day or night." I set my phone aside and moved to the window, looking out at the city lights spread below our high-rise apartment. Somewhere out there, James was with Melissa, both of them believing they were in control of their narrative, that their secret was safe, that the future they imagined together was still possible. They had no idea what was coming. None of them did. Not James, not Melissa, not the colleagues who had admired and respected him for years. 8 days. 8 days until "once a cheater, always a cheater" came full circle in ways James could never have anticipated when he so self-righteously uttered those words 5 years ago. I turned from the window, suddenly exhausted but determined. 8 days to prepare for the end of my marriage and the beginning of whatever came after. 8 days until the reckoning. The week leading up to the gala passed in a blur of preparation and pretense. By day, I continued playing the role of unsuspecting wife, making small talk with James over hurried breakfasts and occasional dinners. By night, when he was with Melissa or working late, sometimes the excuses were actually true, I refined my plan, confirming details and timing until I was confident nothing could go wrong. 3 days before the gala, I did something that felt both necessary and painful. I visited a divorce attorney, not to file papers immediately, but to understand my options and ensure that what I was planning wouldn't negatively impact any future legal proceedings. The attorney, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s named Eleanor Wynne, listened to my sanitized version of events without visible judgment. "So you have evidence of your husband's infidelity," she summarized after I explained the situation without mentioning my plans for public exposure. "And you want to know how best to proceed with a divorce?" "Yes," I said. "I want to be sure I'm protecting myself financially and legally before I confront him." Eleanor nodded approvingly. "That's wise. Many clients act impulsively when they discover infidelity, which can sometimes weaken their position." She leaned forward slightly. "You said you have documentation, texts, photos, receipts?" "Yes," I confirmed. "Substantial evidence gathered over several months." "Good. Wisconsin is a no-fault divorce state, so technically the infidelity won't impact the division of assets directly. But having clear evidence can sometimes influence negotiations, especially if your husband is concerned about his reputation." We spent the next hour discussing practicalities, financial considerations, the timeline of divorce proceedings, what to expect emotionally and logistically in the coming months. By the time I left her office, I had a much clearer picture of the path ahead. What I didn't tell Eleanor was that I had no intention of proceeding with a standard private divorce conversation. James had betrayed me in the most personal way possible while maintaining a public facade of moral superiority. His reckoning would be neither private nor dignified. The night before the gala, James came home earlier than usual. I was in the kitchen preparing dinner, a rarity in recent weeks, when I heard his key in the lock. "Something smells amazing," he said, setting his briefcase by the door and loosening his tie. I glanced up from the stove where I was stirring a risotto, his favorite. "You're home early." He came up behind me, placing his hands on my waist and kissing the back of my neck, a gesture that once would have made me lean into him, but now required all my willpower not to flinch away from. "Thought we could use a quiet night before tomorrow's craziness," he said. "The gala preparations are intense this year." I turned in his arms, searching his face for, what? Some sign of the man I thought I had married? Some flicker of guilt or regret? Whatever I was looking for, I didn't find it. His blue eyes met mine steadily, his expression open and relaxed. "Wine?" I suggested, slipping out of his embrace to reach for the bottle of Barolo I'd opened earlier. Perfect, he said, taking a seat at our kitchen island. How was your day? We fell into conversation that felt almost normal, discussing work projects, a movie we'd both been wanting to see, plans to visit his parents next month, plans I knew would never materialize. If I didn't know better, if I hadn't spent months tracking his lies and betrayals, I might have believed we were still the couple we appeared to be. Over dinner, James brought up the gala again. My speech is right after the main course, he said, twirling pasta around his fork. Probably around 8:30. Nervous? I asked, taking a sip of wine. He shrugged, a small smile playing at his lips. A little. It's a big night. The Morgan Foundation's annual gala is basically the Super Bowl of networking events in this city, and being named senior partner there puts a target on my back. You'll be amazing, I assured him, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. Everyone there will be impressed. Including Walter Preston, James added, mentioning the CEO of a prominent investment firm he'd been trying to establish a relationship with for years. His table is right in front of the podium. I nodded, filing this information away. Walter Preston was known for his conservative values and emphasis on personal character in business dealings. His presence at the gala added an extra layer of satisfaction to what I had planned. After dinner, James insisted on cleaning up, a rare occurrence that might have touched me once but now just seemed like another manipulation, another way he assuaged whatever small amount of guilt he might feel for his betrayal. Later, in bed, he reached for me in the darkness. I hesitated only briefly before responding, telling myself it was just one more night of pretense, one final act in a marriage that was already dead. His hands on my body felt both familiar and foreign, and I closed my eyes, disconnecting from the moment even as I played my part convincingly enough that he noticed nothing amiss. Afterward, as his breathing deepened into sleep beside me, I stared at the ceiling, a single tear tracking down my temple and into my hair. Tomorrow night, everything would change. Tomorrow night, James would finally face the consequences of his actions. Tomorrow night, the truth would shatter the carefully constructed facade of our lives. I turned away from him, curling onto my side, and allowed myself one final moment of grief for the marriage I had believed in, for the husband I had loved, for the future we had planned together. Then I wiped away the tear, took a deep breath, and closed my eyes. When morning came, it would be the beginning of the end. And I was ready. The day of the gala dawned bright and clear, one of those perfect late spring days that seemed designed to mock my inner turmoil. James was up early, heading to the gym and then to the office for a few hours to tie up loose ends before the evening's event. I'll be home by 4 to get ready, he promised, kissing me goodbye. Cars picking us up at 6. Once he was gone, I set my own preparations in motion. First, a call to Amy, who had become my reluctant accomplice. Everything set for tonight? I asked when she answered. Yes, she confirmed, her voice tight with concern. Liv, are you absolutely sure about this? It's not too late to change your mind. I'm sure, I said firmly. He doesn't get to walk away from this unscathed, Amy. He doesn't get to be the man who preaches once a cheater, always a cheater, while secretly being exactly that. She sighed, a static rush over the phone. I understand why you're doing this. I do. I just worry about what it will do to you. I'll be fine, I insisted, though in truth, I wasn't entirely sure what version of myself would emerge from the wreckage of tonight. I need to do this, not just for me, but for the principle of the thing. Okay, she relented. I'll see you tonight then. And Liv, whatever happens, I'm here for you. Remember that. After hanging up, I spent the next hour making final arrangements, confirming that certain emails were scheduled to send at precisely the right moments, ensuring the PowerPoint presentation I had created was safely loaded onto a USB drive, checking that key pieces of evidence were securely stored in my evening bag. Then I turned my attention to myself. The woman who would attend the Morgan Foundation gala tonight couldn't be the heartbroken wife or the calculating avenger. She needed to be poised, beautiful, and completely in control. Someone whose dignity would remain intact even as she systematically dismantled her husband's carefully constructed life. I started with a long, hot shower, washing away the tension that had accumulated in my muscles over weeks of planning and pretense. Afterward, I applied a face mask and lay on the bed with cucumber slices over my eyes, a parody of self-care that nonetheless helped calm my racing thoughts. By early afternoon, I had transitioned to hair and makeup. I styled my blonde hair in an elegant updo, with a few soft tendrils framing my face. My makeup was flawless but not overdone, enough to ensure I looked my best under the gala's lighting, but not so much that I appeared to be trying too hard. The dress I had chosen for the evening was a statement in itself, a deep sapphire blue gown with a subtle shimmer that caught the light as I moved. The silhouette was classic, fitted through the bodice with a slight flare below the knee, but the open back added an unexpected element of drama. It was the most expensive dress I had ever purchased, a fact that would have bothered me once but now seemed utterly inconsequential given what I was about to do. James arrived home precisely at 4, as promised. He found me in the bedroom, already dressed, applying a final coat of mascara. "Wow," he said, pausing in the doorway. "You look incredible." I met his eyes in the mirror, allowing myself a genuine smile for the first time in weeks. "Thank you." He came up behind me, resting his hands lightly on my bare shoulders. "We're going to be the best-looking couple there," he said, and I could see in his expression that familiar pride, not just in me, but in what I represented as his wife, another asset in his carefully curated life. "I hope so," I said, reaching up to pat one of his hands before standing. "You should start getting ready. The car will be here soon." As James showered and dressed, I did a final check of my evening bag. Phone, lipstick, compact, the USB drive with my presentation, and a small envelope containing what would be the first domino to fall in James's carefully arranged life. At precisely 6 o'clock, the doorman called to let us know our car had arrived. James helped me with my wrap, a simple black pashmina that contrasted elegantly with the blue of my dress, and we headed downstairs. In the elevator, he took my hand, squeezing it gently. "Nervous?" he asked. I looked up at him, taking in the perfect knot of his bow tie, the expensive cut of his tuxedo, the confident set of his shoulders. This was James Walker at the height of his power. Successful, respected, on the verge of a major career advancement, secure in his marriage and his secret affair, believing himself untouchable. "Not at all," I said, and it was the truth. The nerves had faded, replaced by a calm certainty that what I was about to do was necessary and right. "Tonight's going to be unforgettable." He smiled, completely missing the double meaning in my words. "That's my girl." The car ride to the Windsor Hotel was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts. James occasionally checked his phone, texting Melissa perhaps, or reviewing notes for his speech. I gazed out the window at the city passing by, mentally rehearsing the timing and execution of each phase of my plan. When we arrived at the hotel, the scene was exactly as expected. Red carpet leading to the entrance, photographers capturing the arrivals of the city's elite, elegantly dressed couples making their way inside. James placed his hand at the small of my back, guiding me with practiced ease, smiling for the cameras and nodding to acquaintances as we passed. In the grand ballroom, round tables draped in ivory linens surrounded a dance floor and stage. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the scene, and centerpieces of white roses and hydrangeas added subtle elegance to each table. A string quartet played softly in one corner, providing background music as guests mingled during the cocktail hour. We made our way to our assigned table near the front of the room, where several of James's colleagues and their spouses were already gathered. There were handshakes and air kisses, compliments on my dress, congratulations to James on his promotion. I played my part perfectly, the proud, supportive wife, charming and engaged, but never overshadowing my husband's moment. As we took our seats, I spotted Amy across the room at a table with some mutual friends. She caught my eye and gave an almost imperceptible nod, confirmation that everything was in place. Dinner was served, some iteration of chicken breast with seasonal vegetables that I barely tasted. I sipped water rather than wine, needing complete clarity for what was to come. Beside me, James charmed the table with anecdotes and insights, occasionally placing his hand over mine in a gesture of affection that once would have warmed me but now felt like just another performance. As the main course plates were being cleared, I excused myself. "Just going to freshen up before your speech," I told James, kissing his cheek lightly. In the elegant bathroom, I checked my appearance one final time, reapplied my lipstick, and took several deep breaths. Then I removed the USB drive from my evening bag and headed not back to my table, but to a small anteroom off the main ballroom where the event coordinator was preparing for the award presentations and speeches. "Excuse me," I said, approaching a harried-looking woman with a clipboard. "I'm Olivia Walker, James Walker's wife. He asked me to deliver this to you. It's an updated version of his PowerPoint for his acceptance speech. There were some last-minute changes." The coordinator barely glanced at me, taking the USB drive with a distracted nod. "Thanks. I'll make sure it gets loaded right away." "Perfect," I said, smiling. "It needs to replace the previous version completely." "Got it," she confirmed, already turning away to deal with another issue. I returned to the ballroom just as the dessert course was being served. James raised an eyebrow at my extended absence, but I simply smiled and squeezed his hand. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Everything's perfect," I assured him. "Just ran into Diane from the Children's Hospital Board. You know how she can talk." He nodded, accepting the explanation without question, and turned his attention to the stage where the Foundation's director was stepping up to the podium to begin the evening's program. The next 30 minutes passed in a blur of awards and acknowledgments, recognition for donors, brief speeches from grant recipients, applause for volunteers. Through it all, I maintained my composed exterior while inside, adrenaline began to course through my veins as James's moment approached. Finally, the Foundation director returned to the podium. "And now it is my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, who is being recognized tonight not only for his exceptional contributions to the Morgan Foundation, but also for his recent promotion to senior partner at Wallace & Reed Financial. Please welcome to the stage James Walker." Applause filled the room as James stood, straightening his jacket. He leaned down to kiss me quickly before making his way to the stage, confidence in every step. As he took his place at the podium, I felt a moment of something like regret, not for what I was about to do, but for what could have been if he had been the man I thought I married. Then I pushed the feeling aside and reached for my phone, sending a single text to Amy. "Now." James began his speech with practiced charm, thanking the Foundation, acknowledging his colleagues, making the obligatory joke about being nervous in front of such an illustrious crowd. On the large screens flanking the stage, his company logo appeared, the first slide of what he believed was his carefully prepared presentation. "It's an honor to stand before you tonight," he was saying, "not just as a representative of Wallace & Reed, but as someone who deeply believes in the values this foundation represents: integrity, commitment, and trust." I watched as Amy quietly left her table and slipped out a side door of the ballroom. According to our plan, she was heading to the hotel lobby where Melissa would be arriving momentarily, having received what she thought was an invitation from James to surprise him at the gala. On stage, James continued his speech, unaware that with each word about integrity and trust, he was digging his own grave deeper. "In both our professional and personal lives," he said, his voice confident, "we are defined by the promises we keep and the values we uphold." It was at that exact moment that the first slide of his presentation changed, not to the chart of donation growth he expected, but to a photograph of him and Melissa entering the Holiday Inn Express, his hand intimately placed on the small of her back. A murmur rippled through the crowd. James, facing the audience, didn't immediately realize what was happening behind him. He faltered slightly, confused by the reaction, then turned to look at the screen. I watched as the blood drained from his face, as he stood frozen at the podium, staring at the damning image of himself with a woman who was not his wife. Before he could recover, the slide changed again, this time to screenshots of text messages between him and Melissa, explicit enough to leave no doubt about the nature of their relationship. Another slide followed, hotel receipts, date, and timestamps clearly visible. And then came the final blow, a slide showing a collection of his own quotes about cheaters from early in our relationship, including his sanctimonious, "once a cheater, always a cheater" declaration, juxtaposed with evidence of his affair. The ballroom had gone completely silent. Hundreds of eyes moved between the screen, James's stricken face, and me, still seated calmly at our table, my expression carefully composed. At that moment, the ballroom doors opened, and Melissa walked in, wearing an evening gown and looking confused as she scanned the room. Amy stood a few steps behind her, her role in the setup complete. Melissa's gaze found the screen first, her own face displayed there alongside James's, before landing on James himself, still standing shell-shocked at the podium. Then her eyes found me, and understanding dawned in her expression. James finally seemed to shake himself from his stupor. There's been some mistake, he stammered into the microphone, his voice echoing weakly through the silent room. That was my cue. I stood, every eye in the room turning to me as I calmly walked toward the stage, climbing the steps with deliberate grace. No mistake, James, I said, my voice steady as I approached the podium. Just the truth. You once told me, once a cheater, always a cheater. You said it with such conviction that I believed you actually meant it. I turned to face the stunned audience, which included not only James's colleagues and clients, but also several of our closest friends and my own family members. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this unexpected addition to the evening's program, but I believe in the Morgan Foundation's stated values of honesty and integrity, clearly more than my husband does. From the corner of my eye, I could see James's face contort with a mixture of shock, rage, and humiliation, but he remained frozen in place, perhaps understanding that any attempt to stop me now would only make things worse. I learned of my husband's affair 3 months ago, I continued, my voice clear and controlled. At first, I was simply heartbroken. Then, as I discovered the extent of his deception, lies told not just to me but to many of you in this room, I realized that private confrontation wouldn't be sufficient. I gestured to the screen, where a particularly damning text exchange was displayed. A man who loudly proclaims moral standards while secretly violating them deserves to be held publicly accountable, especially when that hypocrisy extends to his professional conduct as well. With that, I nodded to the technician controlling the presentation, who had been instructed to switch to the second portion, the evidence of James's ethical shortcomings at work. The screen changed to display emails showing him taking credit for a junior analyst's work, followed by documents revealing how he had misrepresented certain investment risks to clients. A new wave of murmurs swept through the crowd. Near the front of the room, I could see Walter Preston, the conservative CEO James had been so eager to impress, watching with a stony expression. I believe, I said, looking directly at James, that character is revealed not by what we say, but by what we do when we think no one is watching. And when no one was watching, James, this is who you chose to be. I stepped away from the podium, leaving James standing alone on the stage with the evidence of his betrayals displayed behind him. As I walked past Melissa, who remained near the entrance looking stricken, I paused. He told me about you, you know, I said quietly, though in the hushed room my words carried. 5 years ago when we were dating, he told me about the woman he'd cheated on to be with me. He said he'd ended it because he couldn't respect himself if he continued. I wonder if he told you a similar story about me. Her eyes widened, and I knew my suspicion had been correct. James had used the same playbook with both of us, presenting himself as the reluctant cheater driven by true love rather than selfish desire. Without waiting for her response, I continued walking, head high, through the center of the ballroom toward the exit. As I passed Amy, she fell into step beside me, slipping her arm through mine in silent support. Behind us, chaos erupted. James finally finding his voice to call my name, people rising from their tables in confusion, the foundation director rushing to the stage in an attempt to regain control of the situation. But I didn't look back. I had said what I needed to say, had done what I needed to do. James's carefully constructed life, built on lies, hypocrisy, and betrayal, was collapsing behind me, and I felt nothing but a cold satisfaction as the ballroom doors closed between us, symbolically closing the door on our marriage as well. Outside in the warm night air, I finally allowed myself a deep, shuddering breath. "You okay?" Amy asked quietly, her grip on my arm tightening. I considered the question seriously. Was I okay? My marriage was over. My life as I had planned it was over. In a single evening, I had publicly exposed my husband's infidelity and professional misconduct, ensuring that neither our social circle nor his business associates would ever view him the same way again. Yet standing there in my sapphire dress with the weight of secrets finally lifted from my shoulders, I felt something unexpected. Freedom. The freedom that comes from speaking truth, from refusing to be complicit in one's own betrayal, from reclaiming power that had been taken through deception. "No," I answered honestly, "but I will be." Amy nodded, understanding what I couldn't fully articulate. "My car's around the corner, let's get out of here." As we walked away from the Windsor Hotel, I could almost feel the reverberation of the explosion I had detonated behind me. By morning, everyone who mattered in our world would know what James had done, both to me and to the professional standards he claimed to uphold. His promotion would almost certainly be rescinded. His reputation, both personal and professional, would be in tatters. And somewhere in that ballroom, he was facing the consequences of his choices, finally understanding that his own words had come full circle. Once a cheater, always a cheater. A prophecy he had fulfilled, and a judgment he now had to live with. Tomorrow would bring lawyers and logistics, explanations to family, and discussions about dividing assets. But tonight, walking away from the ruins of my marriage with my head high and my dignity intact, I felt the first fragile beginnings of whatever would come next. It wasn't healing, not yet, but it was a start. The aftermath hit like waves against a rocky shore, relentless, powerful, and impossible to ignore. By the time I woke up on Amy's couch the next morning, the story had spread through our social circle like wildfire. My phone displayed 63 missed calls, 97 text messages, and countless notifications from social media platforms I hadn't checked since fleeing the gala. Coffee? Amy appeared in the doorway of her small living room, already dressed for the day in jeans and a faded Northwestern University sweatshirt, her dark hair pulled into a messy ponytail. She held 2 steaming mugs, her expression a careful mix of concern and cautious optimism. I pushed myself upright, running a hand through my tangled hair. The elegant updo from last night was long gone. Amy had helped me take out the pins before I'd collapsed into exhausted sleep, still wearing her borrowed pajamas. My sapphire gown hung in her closet, a glittering reminder of the night I'd blown up my life. "Thanks," I said, accepting the mug she offered. The ceramic was warm against my palms, grounding me in the present moment when my thoughts threatened to spiral into overwhelming territory. Amy settled into the armchair across from me, tucking her feet underneath her. "So," she said simply, "that happened." A startled laugh escaped me, surprising us both. "Yes," I agreed, "it certainly did." We sat in silence for a moment, sipping our coffee. Outside her apartment windows, the city was fully awake, Saturday morning traffic creating a distant hum that felt surreal after the emotional intensity of the previous night. "Have you looked at your phone?" Amy asked eventually. I shook my head. "Not yet. I'm almost afraid to. I don't blame you, but you should probably check the texts from your attorney at least. I saw her name pop up a few times when your phone was lighting up earlier." I sighed and reached for my phone, mentally bracing myself as I unlocked the screen. As expected, the notifications were overwhelming. Texts and calls from friends, family members, even acquaintances I hadn't spoken to in months. James's name appeared multiple times, his messages coming in bursts throughout the night. I ignored those for now, searching instead for Eleanor Wynn's name among the texts. There it was, 3 messages sent between 11:30 p.m. and this morning. "Please call when you can. Developments we should discuss. Given tonight's events, we should meet tomorrow. My office is open Saturday mornings. 9 a.m. appointment available if you can make it. Please confirm." I checked the time, 7:42 a.m. Enough time to shower, borrow some clothes from Amy, and make it downtown by 9. "I need to meet my attorney at 9, I told Amy. "Can I borrow something to wear?" "Of course," she said, setting her mug aside. "But first, are you okay? Really?" The question hung between us, heavier than it had seemed when she'd asked it outside the hotel last night. Was I okay? The initial surge of vindication that had carried me through the gala had faded, leaving behind a complex tangle of emotions I couldn't fully identify. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "I don't regret what I did, but I think the reality of everything is starting to sink in." Amy nodded, understanding in her eyes. "It's going to be messy for a while, but I'm here for whatever you need. A place to stay, a shoulder to cry on, someone to stop you from drunk texting him at 2 a.m. That drew another small laugh from me. "I appreciate that, all of it. Good. Now let's find you something that says, 'I just publicly exposed my cheating husband, and I have 0 regrets.'" An hour later, dressed in Amy's black pants and a borrowed burgundy blouse that was slightly too tight across the shoulders, I was in a rideshare heading to Eleanor Wynn's office. I'd texted her to confirm the appointment, but hadn't yet looked at any of my other messages. That particular emotional gauntlet would have to wait. The city looked different somehow, the same buildings and streets I'd passed hundreds of times before, but viewed now through the lens of someone whose life had irrevocably changed. I felt strangely disconnected, as if watching my life unfold from a distance rather than living it directly. Eleanor was waiting when I arrived, her office already humming with the quiet efficiency that seemed to characterize everything about her. She greeted me with a firm handshake and ushered me into her private office, closing the door firmly behind us. "Well," she said as we sat down, "that was certainly a more dramatic opening to divorce proceedings than I typically recommend." I felt heat rise to my cheeks. "You heard about the gala?" She raised an eyebrow. "Everyone in our social circle has heard about the gala, Mrs. Walker. It's not every day that a senior partner at Wallace & Reed is publicly exposed for both infidelity and professional misconduct during a charity event." She leaned back in her chair, studying me. "I'm guessing that PowerPoint presentation wasn't spontaneous." "No," I admitted. "I've been planning it since I discovered his affair 3 months ago." "I see." Her expression revealed neither approval nor condemnation. "And the professional misconduct allegations? Those are substantiated?" "Yes," I said firmly. "Everything I presented was documented and verified. I have copies of all the evidence." Eleanor nodded slowly. "That's actually why I wanted to meet today. The situation has become considerably more complex since our conversation earlier this week." She opened a folder on her desk and removed a printed email. "This came through at 6 a.m. from Bernard Wallace himself, the founding partner of your husband's firm." She slid the paper across to me. "They're requesting a meeting with you on Monday morning." I scanned the email with growing disbelief. Bernard Wallace, a man I'd met perhaps 3 times at firm events, was personally requesting my presence to discuss the serious allegations raised concerning James Walker's professional conduct. "They want to talk to me, not James?" "According to my sources," Eleanor said carefully, "James is currently suspended pending an internal investigation. The firm is in damage control mode, particularly given that several major clients witnessed the presentation, including, I understand, Walter Preston." I winced slightly. Walter Preston's horrified expression had been briefly satisfying in the moment, but the implications of his presence hadn't fully registered until now. "The firm needs to ascertain exactly what evidence you have and how widely it might have been shared," Eleanor continued. "They're also likely concerned about potential legal exposure if clients decide your husband's actions constituted fraud or breach of fiduciary duty." My stomach tightened. "I never intended to cause that kind of problem. I just wanted James to face consequences for his betrayal." "And he will," Eleanor assured me. "But so might others. The firm could potentially face lawsuits if clients believe they were knowingly misled about investment risks or returns." She paused, tapping a manicured fingernail against her desk. "This is actually an unexpected advantage for you in divorce proceedings." "How so?" "The firm will want to settle this quickly and quietly. They'll pressure James to do the same with your divorce, likely offering a more generous settlement than he might otherwise agree to in exchange for your discretion regarding further details of his professional conduct." I considered this, turning the email over in my hands. "So what do I do now?" "First, we attend the meeting on Monday, together. I'll be there as your legal counsel." Eleanor made a note in the file. "Second, we accelerate the divorce filing. I'll have papers drawn up today and delivered to James wherever he's currently staying." She looked up. "Do you know where that is, by the way?" I shook my head. "I assume either a hotel or possibly with her." Saying Melissa's name still felt too painful, too real. "We'll find him," Eleanor said with quiet confidence. "The third step is securing your financial position. Have you made any progress on the items we discussed previously? Separate accounts? Documentation of assets?" "Yes," I said. "I opened my own account 2 weeks ago and transferred half our savings. I also have detailed records of all our assets and accounts." "Excellent." She made another note. "There's one more thing we should discuss. The apartment. Given the circumstances, I strongly advise against you returning there, at least for now. James is likely emotional and potentially unstable. It's better to communicate only through me until things settle." The thought of not going home, of never going home again really, hit me harder than I'd expected. That apartment had been our first real home together, filled with memories and carefully chosen furnishings that reflected both our tastes. The idea of abandoning it felt like another loss piled atop the many I was already processing. "I already signed a lease on a new place," I said, pushing through the wave of emotion. "But I need to get my things from the apartment." "We can arrange that," Eleanor assured me. "I'll have one of my associates accompany you, perhaps tomorrow when James is less likely to be there. We'll notify him in advance as a courtesy, but you have every right to retrieve your personal belongings." We spent the next hour discussing logistics, what documents I needed to gather, how the divorce proceedings would likely unfold, what financial outcomes I could reasonably expect. Through it all, Eleanor was briskly efficient, treating my situation with the same professional detachment I imagined she brought to all her cases. It was only as our meeting wrapped up that she showed a glimpse of something more personal. "Mrs. Walker, Olivia," she said, her voice softening slightly, "I've been practicing family law for 27 years. I've seen every kind of betrayal and every kind of revenge. What you did last night was unconventional and certainly dramatic, but I want you to know I don't judge you for it." I blinked, surprised by this departure from her professional demeanor. "When people ask why I became a divorce attorney," she continued, "I usually give some answer about believing in fresh starts. The truth is, my first husband had an affair with my sister. When I found out, I burned his expensive suits in our backyard fire pit." A startled laugh escaped me. "So you see," she said with the ghost of a smile, "I understand the impulse, but from this point forward, we proceed strategically, not emotionally. Can you do that?" I nodded, feeling something like resolve crystallize within me. "Yes, I can do that." "Good." She closed my file and stood. "I'll see you Monday morning at 9 a.m. We'll meet here first to prepare, then head to Wallace and Reed together." As I left Eleanor's office, I felt strangely lighter, as if having a concrete plan had somehow made the chaos more manageable. The raw emotional wound of James's betrayal was still there, still painful, but it was now contained within a framework of practical next steps that gave me something to focus on beyond the hurt. Back on the street, I checked my phone again, steeling myself against the onslaught of notifications. Most were messages of support or curiosity from friends and family, expressions of shock, offers of help, requests for details. I sent a brief group text to my closest friends and my parents, assuring them I was okay and promising to explain everything soon. Then, taking a deep breath, I opened James's messages. "Where are you? We need to talk." "Olivia, answer your phone. This is insane. You've ruined everything. I hope you're satisfied. Please just tell me where you are. We can work this out. This wasn't all my fault. You've been distant for months. I'm sorry, okay? Is that what you want to hear? I'm fucking sorry. They're suspending me. My career is over. Are you happy now? Olivia, please. I love you. What happened with Melissa was a mistake." The messages continued in this vein, cycling through anger, self-pity, pleading, and blame. The final one had come through just an hour ago. "I'm at the Marriott downtown, room 412. Please come talk to me." I felt nothing as I read his words, no satisfaction at his distress, no softening at his apologies, no guilt at his accusations. It was as if the emotional connection that had once made his feelings so important to me had been completely severed. I blocked his number without responding, then did the same for the unfamiliar number that had to be Melissa, based on the single text it had sent. "We need to talk about James." No, we really didn't. My Uber driver glanced at me in the rearview mirror as I slipped my phone back into my borrowed purse. "Bad news?" he asked sympathetically. I considered the question, looking out at the city streaming past the windows. "Bad news? My marriage was over. My husband was a liar and a cheat. My life had been upended in ways I was only beginning to comprehend. And yet, actually," I said, surprising myself with the realization, "I think it might be good news. I'm just not used to it yet." The next few days passed in a blur of practical matters that kept me mercifully distracted from the emotional hurricane I knew was brewing just below the surface. With Amy and Eleanor's help, I retrieved essential items from the apartment on Sunday morning, a strange experience that felt like robbing my own life. James wasn't there, true to Eleanor's prediction, but evidence of his hasty departure was everywhere. Drawers left partially open, a half-empty bottle of scotch on the kitchen counter, his favorite watch forgotten on the bathroom vanity. I collected my clothes, jewelry, important documents, and a few sentimental items that were unquestionably mine, leaving everything else for later division. The new apartment Eleanor had helped me secure was small but elegant, a furnished one-bedroom in a secure building with a doorman and strict visitor policies. It felt like a hotel at first, devoid of personal touches or history, but also peaceful in its anonymity. No memories lurked in these rooms, no ghost of a failed marriage haunted these spaces. By Monday morning, I felt as prepared as possible for the meeting at Wallace & Reed. Dressed in a charcoal gray suit that conveyed appropriate seriousness without appearing somber, I met Eleanor at her office as agreed. "Remember," she said as we walked the 3 blocks to the financial district together, "let me do most of the talking. They'll try to ascertain exactly what evidence you have and how you obtained it. Say as little as possible about your methods. The focus should be on James's actions, not yours." I nodded, mentally rehearsing the careful responses we'd practiced. The evidence of James's professional misconduct had been legitimately obtained. I hadn't hacked accounts or stolen documents, but the circumstances of my discovery weren't something I was eager to explain in detail. Wallace & Reed occupied the top 5 floors of a gleaming office tower that screamed old money and established success. The reception area on the 30th floor featured muted gray marble, tasteful abstract art, and fresh flower arrangements that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget. The receptionist, a poised woman in her early 30s, greeted us with professional warmth. "Mrs. Walker, Ms. Wynne, welcome. Mr. Wallace and Mr. Reed are expecting you in the conference room. May I offer you coffee or water before I show you in?" We declined refreshments and followed her down a hushed corridor to a large conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Bernard Wallace and Thomas Reed, the founding partners whose names graced the building's directory, were already seated at the massive table, along with a third man I recognized as the firm's chief legal counsel, Howard Bentley. Bernard Wallace rose as we entered, a tall, imposing figure with silver hair and the weathered tan of someone who spent weekends on golf courses and evenings on yacht decks. At 72, he still maintained the physique and posture of the collegiate athlete he'd once been. "Mrs. Walker," he said, extending his hand, "thank you for coming. I understand these are difficult circumstances." His grip was firm, his expression grave but not unkind. Thomas Reed, shorter, balding, with shrewd eyes behind expensive glasses, nodded in acknowledgement but seemed content to let his partner take the lead. "This is my attorney, Eleanor Wynne," I said, gesturing to Eleanor, who was already exchanging greetings with Howard Bentley. We settled around the table, the firm's representatives on one side, Eleanor and I on the other. A classic negotiation setup, though what exactly we were negotiating remained to be seen. "Mrs. Walker," Bernard began once we were seated, "I want to start by saying how deeply troubled we are by the allegations concerning James's professional conduct that were presented at the Morgan Foundation Gala. While the personal aspects of the situation are, of course, painful, our immediate concern as a firm must be the potential ethical and regulatory implications of his actions." I nodded, following Eleanor's advice to say as little as possible. "We understand you have documentation supporting these allegations," Bernard continued. "We'd like to understand exactly what you've discovered and how it came into your possession." Eleanor smoothly took over, her voice cool and professional. "My client discovered evidence of Mr. Walker's professional misconduct during the course of investigating his personal infidelity. The documentation was obtained legally from Mr. Walker's work computer, to which Mrs. Walker had legitimate access. The evidence suggests patterns of behavior that may constitute violations of both company ethics policies and potentially regulatory standards." Howard Bentley leaned forward slightly. "Could you be more specific about the nature of this access?" "Mr. Walker provided my client with his spare security key fob and the password to his work computer in case of emergency," Eleanor replied smoothly, stretching the truth just enough. When Mrs. Walker discovered her husband's infidelity, she checked his work calendar to confirm suspicious patterns in his schedule and discovered the questionable professional conduct in the process. Not the complete truth, but close enough. And more importantly, a version that wouldn't raise legal concerns about how I'd accessed the information. "I see," said Bernard, exchanging glances with his partners. "And the specific allegations?" The presentation at the gala mentioned misrepresentation of investment risks and taking credit for others' work, among other issues. Eleanor removed a folder from her briefcase and slid it across the table. This contains copies of the primary evidence. As you'll see, there are emails showing Mr. Walker taking credit for analysis performed by junior team members, documentation of his misrepresenting certain risk factors to clients including the Donovan Group and Harrington Industries, and evidence of him backdating compliance documents in at least 3 instances. The 3 men spent several minutes reviewing the documents in silence. I watched their expressions shift from professional concern to genuine alarm as they grasped the extent of James's ethical shortcuts. "This is deeply troubling," Bernard said finally, closing the folder. "If verified, and we will conduct our own investigation, of course, these actions represent serious violations of our firm's policies and values. And potentially SEC regulations," added Thomas Reed, speaking for the first time. His voice was unexpectedly soft, almost gentle, but his eyes were hard as they scanned the documents again. "Particularly the Harrington Industries situation. That could expose the firm to significant liability." Howard Bentley cleared his throat. "Mrs. Walker, I must ask, have you shared this information with anyone else? Any regulatory bodies, other clients, or the press?" "No," I said, meeting his gaze directly. "My purpose in presenting this information at the gala was to hold my husband accountable for his actions, not to damage the firm's reputation. The only people who have seen these documents are those who attended the gala, and now you." The relief in the room was palpable. "And your intentions going forward?" Bernard asked carefully. Eleanor smiled thinly. "My client has no desire to cause unnecessary harm to Wallace and Reed as an institution. Her concerns are personal and specific to James Walker. However," she added, her tone sharpening slightly, "she does expect the firm to address these issues appropriately, both in terms of internal accountability and proper disclosure to affected clients." "Of course," Bernard agreed quickly. "We've already begun that process. James has been suspended pending our investigation, and we're reviewing all of his client accounts and transactions. We'd also like to discuss a mutual resolution that acknowledges the difficult position Mrs. Walker has been placed in," Howard added, his meaning clear even in the careful phrasing. Eleanor's smile remained precise and controlled. "We anticipated as much. Mrs. Walker is in the process of filing for divorce from James, as I'm sure comes as no surprise. Given the circumstances and the evidence of both personal and professional misconduct, we expect a generous settlement that reflects the damage done to her personally and to the plans they had built together." Thomas Reed nodded. "The firm has a vested interest in resolving this situation quickly and discreetly. While we can't directly intervene in personal matters between James and Mrs. Walker, we can certainly ensure that he understands the importance of a fair and expedient resolution." The message was clear. The firm would pressure James to settle the divorce on terms favorable to me in exchange for my continued discretion regarding his professional misconduct. "Additionally," Eleanor continued, "Mrs. Walker would appreciate the firm's assistance in expediting certain practical matters, transferring lease obligations, addressing joint financial accounts, and ensuring her personal financial security is not negatively impacted by actions the firm may take regarding James's employment." "That seems reasonable," Bernard agreed, making notes. "Howard will work with you directly on those details." The meeting continued for another hour, with specific arrangements discussed and commitments made. By the time we left, I had assurances that the firm would ensure James cooperated with divorce proceedings, that my financial interests would be protected, and that the firm would address the professional misconduct appropriately without unnecessarily dragging my name into regulatory matters. Outside the building, Eleanor and I paused on the sidewalk. "That went well," she said, satisfaction evident in her voice. "Better than I expected, honestly. They're running scared." "They should be," I replied, thinking of the expressions on their faces as they reviewed the evidence. "James put their reputation at risk. That matters more to them than anything." "Exactly, which works entirely in our favor." She checked her watch. "I have another appointment, but we'll talk later. The divorce filing will be delivered to James today, and Howard promised to ensure he doesn't contest it or the temporary financial arrangements we've requested." I nodded, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and emptiness. This was progress, concrete, tangible progress toward disentangling my life from James's. So why didn't it feel more victorious? "Olivia," Eleanor said, her voice softening slightly. "This is just the beginning of the process. The legal aspects may move quickly, especially with the firm's pressure on James, but the emotional recovery takes longer. Be patient with yourself." I attempted a smile. "I'm fine, really, just tired." She studied me for a moment, clearly not believing me but professional enough not to push. "Call if you need anything. Otherwise, I'll update you once the papers have been served." As she walked away, I stood for a moment on the busy sidewalk, feeling oddly disconnected from the stream of people flowing around me. Everyone looked so purposeful, so certain of their destinations and the lives they were returning to after this meeting or that errand. I had nowhere to be, no job to return to. I'd taken a leave of absence from the interior design firm where I worked. No home that truly felt like mine. The structure that had defined my days for years, the routine of a shared life, the rhythms of marriage, had dissolved, leaving me adrift in a sea of hours to fill and emotions to process. My phone buzzed with a text from Amy. "How did the meeting go? Want to grab lunch?" The thought of recounting the meeting, of making conversation and pretending to have an appetite, felt overwhelming. "Rain check?" I texted back. "Need some time alone." "Okay," she responded immediately. "Doors always open if you change your mind." I slipped my phone back into my purse and began walking, with no particular destination in mind. The late April day was surprisingly pleasant, warm sunshine, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of blooming trees from the nearby park. In another life, my previous life, I might have appreciated the weather, perhaps suggested to James that we have dinner on a restaurant patio or take a walk along the river. Now, the beauty of the day felt almost offensive, an insult to the storm of confusion and grief churning inside me. How dare the world look so normal, so unchanged, when everything in my life had been upended? I found myself at the entrance to Riverside Park, where James and I had often spent Sunday afternoons in the early days of our relationship. Without conscious decision, my feet carried me to our bench, a wooden seat overlooking a small duck pond, partially shaded by an ancient oak tree. No one occupied the bench today, and I sank onto it gratefully, suddenly aware of how exhausted I felt. The emotional adrenaline that had carried me through the gala, through the immediate aftermath, through this morning's meeting, it was finally ebbing, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness that made even sitting upright feel like a monumental effort. I watched a pair of mallards glide across the pond's surface, leaving gentle ripples in their wake. A mother helped her toddler throw bits of bread to the eager ducks, both of them laughing at the birds' enthusiastic responses. An elderly man on a nearby bench read a newspaper, occasionally glancing up to observe the scene with a small smile. Life continuing. The world spinning on its axis. People finding joy in small moments, unaware of the woman sitting alone on a bench, her life in pieces. For the first time since discovering James's betrayal, I allowed myself to fully feel the loss, not just of the husband who had betrayed me or the marriage that had been built on lies, but of the future I had believed in so completely. The children we'd planned to have, the house in the suburbs we'd been saving for. The growing old together that had seemed so certain, so inevitable, gone. All of it gone. A sob rose in my throat, catching me by surprise with its intensity. I pressed a hand to my mouth, trying to contain the emotion that threatened to overwhelm me in this public place. But it was too powerful, too primal to be suppressed. Tears spilled down my cheeks, and my shoulders shook with the force of grief finally given free rein. I don't know how long I sat there crying for everything I had lost, and everything I had never truly had. Eventually the storm passed, leaving me drained but somehow lighter, as if some poisonous pressure had been released. I wiped my face with tissues from my purse, grateful that the park was relatively empty on a Monday afternoon. The ducks continued their peaceful circuits of the pond. The toddler and his mother had moved on. The elderly man still read his newspaper, either oblivious to my breakdown or tactfully pretending to be. My phone buzzed again, another text from Amy. "Just checking in. You've gone quiet. You okay?" I stared at the message, considering my response. Was I okay? No, not really. But I was something I couldn't quite name yet. Somewhere between broken and healing, between ending and beginning. "Had a good cry in the park," I texted back honestly. "Feeling a bit better. Going to walk a while longer, then head home. Talk later?" Her response came immediately. "Crying is good. Walking too. Call anytime, day or night. Love you." I tucked the phone away and stood, stretching muscles stiff from sitting too long. The path ahead curved through flowering cherry trees, their pale pink blossoms occasionally drifting down in the gentle breeze. I began walking again, this time with more purpose. One step at a time, one day at a time, one breath at a time. That was all anyone could do, really, when rebuilding a life from scratch. And that was what I was doing now. Not just ending a marriage, but starting again, alone for the first time in 5 years. The thought was terrifying, and exhilarating, and necessary. As I left the park and headed toward my new apartment, I felt something unfamiliar stirring beneath the grief and anger, a tentative curiosity about what might come next. Not happiness, not yet, but perhaps the first fragile seed from which happiness might eventually grow. The divorce proceedings moved with surprising speed, propelled by the firm's desire to resolve the situation quickly and James's apparent resignation to the inevitable. Within 2 weeks of the gala, we had a signed settlement agreement that was remarkably favorable to me, the result of Eleanor's skilled negotiation and Wallace and Reed's behind-the-scenes pressure on James. I received 60% of our joint assets, full ownership of my retirement accounts, a generous cash settlement, and an additional payment characterized as emotional distress compensation. James kept his own retirement funds, what remained of them after the firm's disciplinary actions, his car, and certain personal possessions we'd agreed upon through our attorneys. Neither of us wanted the apartment. Too many memories, too much emotional baggage, so it was sold, with the proceeds added to the assets divided between us. I never saw James during this process. Everything was handled through lawyers and paperwork, his signature appearing on documents like the ghost of someone I'd once known intimately, but now couldn't quite remember clearly. My life settled into new patterns. I extended my leave of absence from work, using the time to recalibrate my sense of self and direction. I explored parts of the city I'd never visited, took long walks along the lakefront, signed up for a pottery class I'd always been curious about. I reconnected with friends I'd somewhat neglected during my marriage, and strengthened bonds with family members who provided unconditional support. News about James came to me secondhand, filtered through mutual acquaintances or professional contacts who couldn't resist sharing updates despite my insistence that I wasn't interested. He had been terminated from Wallace and Reed after their investigation confirmed the ethical violations I'd exposed. He was working with a recruiter to find a new position, but prospects were dim given the circumstances of his departure. He and Melissa had broken up shortly after the gala, their relationship apparently unable to survive the transition from exciting affair to complicated reality. I told myself I didn't care about any of this information, that James's life was no longer of any concern to me. But in quiet moments, I had to admit that each piece of news brought a complex satisfaction. Not joy in his suffering exactly, but validation that actions had consequences, that the reckoning I'd set in motion had been necessary and just. 6 weeks after the gala, the divorce was finalized with remarkable efficiency, helped along by the uncontested settlement and the judge's sympathy for my situation. I didn't attend the final hearing. Eleanor handled everything, calling afterward to formally congratulate me on my return to single status. That night, Amy insisted on taking me out to dinner, not to celebrate, she was careful to clarify, but to mark the transition. We went to an upscale restaurant I'd never visited with James, where she ordered champagne despite my protests. "To new beginnings," she said, raising her glass. "And to the strongest woman I know." I clinked my glass against hers, feeling oddly solemn despite the ostensibly celebratory moment. "I don't feel particularly strong," I admitted. "Most days I still feel like I'm barely holding it together." "That's exactly what makes you strong," Amy countered. "You're moving forward despite everything. You're rebuilding. That takes more courage than most people ever have to find." I considered this as I sipped my champagne, the bubbles tickling my nose. I keep waiting to feel triumphant, you know, like I won something by exposing him, by getting a good settlement, by surviving all of this. But mostly I just feel empty, Amy suggested gently when I trailed off. Not exactly empty, more like unfinished. Like there's still something missing from this whole experience, some final piece that would make it all make sense. Amy studied me across the table, her expression thoughtful. "Maybe you need closure with James himself. You've never actually talked to him since that night, have you?" I shook my head. There didn't seem to be any point. Everything we needed to say to each other was said through lawyers. "But that's just it," You haven't said anything to each other, not directly, not as Olivia and James rather than plaintiff and defendant. She hesitated, then added, I'm not suggesting you need his apology or explanation to move on, but sometimes facing the person who hurt you, on your terms and in your own time, can help you close that chapter more definitively. I toyed with my napkin, uncomfortable with the suggestion but unable to dismiss it entirely. I wouldn't even know what to say to him. Maybe you don't need to say anything. Maybe you just need to look him in the eye one last time and let yourself feel whatever comes up without the performance of the gala or the formality of legal proceedings. The thought was both terrifying and strangely compelling. James had been excised from my life with surgical precision, cut away like a tumor without the messy confrontation that usually accompanies the end of a marriage. Perhaps that clinical removal was part of why I felt unsettled, like a ghost limb still aching after amputation. I'll think about it, I promised Amy, though I had no real intention of reaching out to James. What would be the point? What could either of us possibly say that would change anything? But the seed had been planted, and over the next few days I found myself increasingly preoccupied with the idea. Not because I wanted reconciliation or even forgiveness, those bridges had been thoroughly burned. But perhaps Amy was right that some kind of direct confrontation, some final exchange on my terms, might help me move forward more completely. It was Eleanor who provided the unexpected catalyst when she called the following week with news that James had requested the return of a family heirloom, his grandfather's vintage pocket watch, which had been overlooked in our division of property. Legally, it's his, Eleanor said. It was a gift from his grandfather, clearly intended to stay in his family. I'd advise returning it rather than creating an unnecessary conflict. Of course, I agreed. The watch held no sentimental value for me. I'd included it in my property inventory only because it had been in our safe deposit box with my jewelry. Should I send it to him through your office? There was a slight pause before Eleanor answered. Actually, he's asked if he could pick it up from you directly. He says there are a few things he'd like to say in person. Her tone sharpened. You're under no obligation to agree. I can tell him to submit his request in writing, and you can respond the same way. I found myself oddly calm at the prospect of seeing James again. No, it's fine. He can pick up the watch. Are you sure? You don't owe him a meeting, Olivia. I know. I took a deep breath, surprised by my own certainty. But I think it might be good for me too. Some final closure. Eleanor didn't sound convinced, but she respected my decision, helping arrange a meeting for the following afternoon at a neutral location, a quiet cafe near my new apartment. She offered to have someone from her office present, but I declined. This needed to be just James and me, one last time. I slept poorly that night, my dreams a confused jumble of memories and imagined scenarios. In one particularly vivid sequence, I stood on a stage giving a presentation while James watched from the audience, his expression unreadable. I kept trying to advance to the next slide, but the same image appeared again and again. Our wedding photo, his face gradually fading until I stood alone in the frame. I woke feeling unrested but resolute. Whatever happened at this meeting, it would be the final chapter in the story of us. After today, James would no longer be my husband, my betrayer, my target of revenge. He would simply be someone I used to know, a character in the backstory of my life, not a central figure in its current narrative. I dressed carefully that morning, choosing an outfit that was polished but casual, dark jeans, a soft gray cashmere sweater, low-heeled boots. I applied minimal makeup, pulled my hair into a simple ponytail, and wore only small pearl earrings my grandmother had given me long before I met James. Nothing about my appearance would suggest I had made any special effort for this meeting, but I felt armored by my careful choices, protected by the deliberate simplicity. The cafe was half empty when I arrived 15 minutes early, clutching a small gift bag containing the pocket watch. I chose a table near the back, ordered a cappuccino, and waited, my heartbeat steady despite the significance of the moment. James arrived exactly on time, pausing in the doorway to scan the cafe before his eyes found me. He looked different, thinner, tired, his usual confidence dimmed. The expensive suit had been replaced by khakis and a blue button-down that seemed slightly too large for his frame. His hair was longer than he usually wore it, and a shadow of stubble darkened his jaw. He approached slowly, as if unsure of his welcome despite the arranged meeting. "Olivia," he said, his voice softer than I remembered. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." I gestured to the chair across from me. Would you like to order something first? He shook his head, sitting down with careful movements. I'm fine. His eyes scanned my face, searching for what, I wasn't sure. You look well. Thank you, I said, neither agreeing nor disagreeing with his assessment. I placed the small gift bag on the table between us. Your grandfather's watch. James made no move to take it. Thank you for returning it. It means a lot to me. An awkward silence fell between us, 5 years of shared history and 2 months of legal proceedings creating a chasm too wide for small talk to bridge. Finally, James cleared his throat. I've been trying to figure out what to say to you for weeks. Every scenario I imagined seems inadequate. You don't need to say anything, I replied, my voice calmer than I had expected. The watch is yours. The divorce is final. We've both moved on. Have we? He leaned forward slightly, his eyes, those blue eyes I'd once loved so much, intent on mine. I haven't. Moved on, that is. I'm not sure I know how. I felt a flicker of irritation. That's not my problem anymore, James. I know it's not. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so familiar it sent an unexpected pang through me. I'm not asking for sympathy or help. I need you to know how sorry I am, for all of it. I took a sip of my cappuccino, buying time as I considered my response. The apology seemed genuine enough, but what difference did it make now? Sorry you did it or sorry you got caught? The question was sharper than I'd intended, but James didn't flinch from it. Both, if I'm being completely honest. I'm sorry I betrayed you. Sorry I lied. Sorry I hurt you so deeply. And yes, I'm sorry my actions had consequences I never anticipated. At least he wasn't pretending to be noble. I had to give him that much. What did you think would happen, James? That you could cheat on me indefinitely and I'd never find out? That you could be once a cheater, always a cheater guy publicly while secretly being exactly that? He winced at hearing his own words thrown back at him. I don't know what I thought. That's the most pathetic part, I guess. I didn't think. I just fell into it with Melissa, told myself it was temporary, a mistake I'd correct. But then it continued, and the lies got easier, and somehow I convinced myself I was managing it all. I studied him across the table, this man I had once believed I knew completely. You know what the worst part was? Not the affair itself. Affairs happen. People make mistakes. Relationships get complicated. The worst part was listening to you judge other people for the exact behavior you were engaging in, watching you build your entire identity around being morally superior to those people while being one of them all along. James looked down at his hands, now clasped tightly on the table. You're right. The hypocrisy was inexcusable. I've had a lot of time to think about it since the gala, about why I needed to present myself that way, why I was so vocal about fidelity when I knew I wasn't living up to that standard. He paused, then met my eyes again. I think I was trying to convince myself as much as anyone else. If I said it loudly enough and often enough, maybe it would make me become that person, rather than who I actually was. It was probably the most honest thing he'd ever said to me, and I found myself unexpectedly moved by the vulnerability behind it. Not enough to forgive or forget, but enough to see him as a flawed human, rather than the monster I'd constructed in my mind during the darkest days of anger. I appreciate your honesty, I said after a moment, though it comes rather late. I know, he sighed heavily. For what it's worth, everything that's happened, losing you, losing my job, losing friends and reputation, it's forced me to really look at myself. I'm in therapy now, trying to understand why I sabotaged the good things in my life, why I couldn't be honest even with myself. I nodded, uncertain how to respond to this information. Part of me wanted to wish him well in this journey of self-discovery. Another part wanted to point out that his personal growth came at the expense of tremendous pain inflicted on me. I settled for neutrality. That sounds like a positive step. Another silence fell between us, less tense than before but still weighted with unspoken thoughts and feelings. James fidgeted with his watch strap, a nervous habit I'd forgotten until seeing it again brought the memory rushing back. Can I ask you something? He said finally. About the gala? I tensed slightly but nodded. Go ahead. How long had you known? About Melissa, I mean. Before that night. 3 months, I said, watching his face as the information registered. I found out when I brought dinner to your office that night in February. I heard you on the phone with her. Understanding dawned in his expression. The Thai food. I found it outside my door and couldn't figure out where it came from. You never said anything. Number I decided to gather evidence first, to be absolutely certain before confronting you. He looked stricken. So, for 3 months, you were… what? Planning your revenge while pretending everything was normal? I shrugged, uncomfortable with his characterization but unable to deny its essential truth. I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with, and once I knew, I needed you to experience the consequences in a way you couldn't minimize or explain away. Well, mission accomplished there, James said, a hint of bitterness creeping into his tone. The public humiliation was quite thorough. I felt a flare of anger. You don't get to be bitter about how I responded to your betrayal, James. You created that situation, not me. He held up his hands in a gesture of surrender. You're right, I'm sorry, that was unfair. He took a deep breath. I guess I'm still struggling with how everything played out. Not that I didn't deserve consequences. I did. But the public nature of it was fitting, I finished for him. Your hypocrisy was public. Your moral superiority was public. Your judgment of others was public. Why shouldn't the truth about who you really are be equally public? He had no answer for that, his gaze dropping back to his hands. After a moment, I continued, my voice softer. I didn't set out to destroy you, James. I just couldn't let you continue believing you could compartmentalize your life that way. The perfect husband in one box, the unfaithful partner in another, the ethical businessman in a third. Those boundaries you created weren't real. The lies in one area bled into the others. That's what the gala was about, showing you and everyone else the whole truth, all at once. James nodded slowly. I understand that now. I didn't then, but I do now. He looked up, his expression somber. I won't ask for your forgiveness. I know I haven't earned it and may never earn it, but I am truly sorry, Olivia. For everything. You deserved so much better than what I gave you. The words hung between us, surprisingly healing despite everything that had happened. Not because they changed the past or undid the damage, but because they acknowledged it fully, without excuses or deflection. Thank you for saying that, I said quietly. I appreciate it. James reached for the gift bag, finally taking possession of his grandfather's watch. I should go. I've taken enough of your time. He stood, hesitating before adding, I hope you find happiness, Olivia. Real happiness, with someone worthy of your trust. I felt tears threaten unexpectedly, the simple good wish touching something tender within me. I hope you find peace, James, and someday become the person you were pretending to be. He smiled sadly, nodded once, and walked away. I watched him go, this man who had been at the center of my life for 5 years and at the center of my pain for months after. He paused at the door, turned back for one last look, then disappeared into the bright afternoon sunshine. I remained at the table, sipping the last of my now cold cappuccino, surprised by the lightness I felt. Not joy, not triumph, but something quieter and more profound, a sense of completion. The conversation had provided the final piece I'd been missing, the closing of a circle that allowed me to look forward rather than back. James had been right about one thing all those years ago when we first dated. Once a cheater, always a cheater. People rarely change their fundamental nature, but he'd been wrong about something more important, that we are defined forever by our worst mistakes, that we can't grow beyond our flaws. I hoped he would prove that part wrong for his own sake. And I hoped that I would remember the lesson in my own journey forward, that trust, once broken, can be rebuilt, but only with complete honesty and the courage to be fully seen, flaws and all. As I finally left the cafe and stepped into the sunshine, I felt ready for whatever came next. Not because I had successfully exacted my revenge, but because in doing so, I had freed myself from the past that had held me captive. The betrayal would always be part of my story, but it no longer defined me. 5 years after James had confidently proclaimed, once a cheater, always a cheater, we had both learned that human beings are more complex than simple maxims can capture. Life was messier, more complicated, and ultimately more forgiving than either of us had understood. And in that complexity, I had found my way back to myself. Changed, yes, but stronger for having faced the worst and survived. Whatever came next, I would face it with eyes wide open, heart cautious but not closed, wiser for the journey I'd never planned to take. The revenge I'd so carefully orchestrated had served its purpose, not just to make James face consequences, but to free me from the person I'd been with him and the life we'd constructed together. In the end, that was the sweetest victory of all, not his public humiliation, but my private liberation. I walked toward my new apartment, feeling light, unencumbered, finally ready to turn the page and begin the next chapter.